help someone else understand something or push someone else's thinking. So we like to use that as yet another channel for learning. And in the top right-hand corner are some of the controls for how you see the screen, so the speaker view, and you can also have a gallery view where you see everyone who's speaking. And as Kelly mentioned, if you have any troubles along the way, please use the chat to reach out to Kelly and Tanayo, and they will do their best to help you fully participate as much as you can. We're going to go ahead and get started. Our learning objectives for today is to identify how the built environment impacts health and racial equity, name ways to use built environment for emergency preparedness, name strategies to create access to amplify community voice in the built environment and health equity efforts. And we're going to spend a bit of time doing just a slight bit of level setting. We'll look at a little bit of history. As you saw in the description, there's a little bit of thinking about Boston as a test case. We'll be thinking about housing quite a bit today, but also expand to a few other topics, including COVID and climate change, and really thinking about the built environment in those spaces and how we can both think about policy changes that mitigate some of the inequities, as well as engaging community voice in those spaces. I like to always review our group agreements.
Hey Mo, I hate to interrupt you, but
yep.
I don't believe you're sharing your slides, and you might be intending to.
I am intending to, so that is, thank you, because I'm just going on and on thinking that everyone can see everything I'm sharing. So let's try that again. Now, this is the most dangerous thing I do all day, so let's see how that works. Yes?
Looks
Wonderful.
Great, thanks Mo.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. I could have been on there for a while, thanks. That would have been embarrassing. So group agreements, we'll ask folks, as Kelly mentioned, to, as much as you can, be present and engaged.
I'm assuming he froze for everybody, or is it just me?
Not just.
Nope, it looks like Mo froze.
He froze.
Great. Well, while Mo figures that out, I'm happy to go over group agreements for folks. And please, this is a great time just to add any that you might have in the chat box too. So like Mo was saying, we love folks to be present and engaged. And I think that looks different for everyone. So do what you need to do in order to stay present and engaged, whether that's turning your camera off and doing a lap around your office or your living room. I know I've done that many times before. Step up, step back. I'd love to have someone in the room maybe unmute themselves and share what they think that means.
If you're someone who normally talks a lot, take a step back. If you're someone who doesn't, maybe try a little more. I actually am someone who tends to not talk first, so I decided to try it.
Thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate that. I know I'm the same way. I definitely like to make space for others first. And then sometimes I'm like, oh, they took my thunder. But thank you for modeling that. And you said it way better than I could have. We also just ask that folks mute themselves when they're not speaking, just to control for background noise. I think if we hear some feedback, Tanayo or myself might mute you. Do not take that personally. We're not trying to, oh, and it looks like Mo might have come back. But if we do mute you, we're not trying to silence you. We're just trying to control for background noise. But please unmute yourself and interrupt whenever you have a thought or a question. This is a Zoom meeting and not a webinar, because we value your voice and your perspective, and we want this to be a conversation. Mo, how we doing over in your home office?
I think I'm on. Yes, you can hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. So Zoom just sent me a message that said that it quit. which I was a little concerned about because, you know, we've got a long relationship here. I've been courting for 10 months, and to quit me just like that was, you know, that's like sending a text to break up. That's not going to work for me.
Yeah, it sounds like you were blindsided by that too, which very rude
Yeah.
on Zoom's house.
Very, very rude on Zoom's part. I can't, I don't know what's going on with Zooms these days. Anyway, we were talking about group agreements. Apologies on that slight delay. As much as you can to step up and step back, and when you're not speaking, to mute. We ask folks to really be conscious about taking care of yourselves. We're all trying to do this during a pandemic, and many things come up. Children are always welcome. They are not inconvenient. Stray pets that happen to come into the screen, that's always good too. We're gonna ask you to be flexible. As you just saw there, Zoom decided to quit when, you know, when I didn't expect it to. So this is not a perfect medium, and we may have other spaces like that. Likewise, with the material, I'll ask you to give yourself some grace and patience. Sometimes it can be difficult to try things on, or to look at things from a different perspective, or to be pushed by a concept. To extend that grace to others, know that you know, folks are here with their best intentions, and so we want to assume those best intentions. So if you hear something that pushes you a little bit, or maybe even irks you a little bit, try to listen for the heart that it was meant with. And also to join us in a brave space. We are here to learn, and sometimes learning takes a bit of stretching. Sometimes it takes a bit of getting uncomfortable. And also that you can hold a thought in your mind without accepting it. So as much as possible to try to be in that explorer space. Any additions to what you'd like to see in terms of the group agreements? Anybody have something they want to add? Okay. Wonderful. All right, we will jump into it then. All right, so I'm going to ask you to use the chat. In the chat, I want you to put your name, your organization and role, and an activity or hobby that brings you joy. An activity or hobby that brings you joy. And you do get a bonus if it's something you picked up during the pandemic. All right. Some of y'all, I'm sure, have got that started in the fridge, a little sourdough going, little sourdough baby in the fridge. Yeah. I've broken out my pasta making skills and the various pasta machines that have been sitting around for a few years. It's been good. There's some fusilli in my future, I think. All right. Just ask if folks could, again, just in the chat, go ahead and put your name, organization, and role, and an activity that brings you joy. All right. I see some gardening, I see some photography and roller skating, cooking. Cooking I'm always down with. Running, I've heard of that. I thought I saw laundry, but I'm trying not to because it's you know, pushing a button right now. Good. Writing, reading, absolutely. Maybe like even reading a physical book. Yeah. Eating, I'm with you, Selena. Absolutely. Yoga, awesome. Yeah. Juliet, I think you told the biggest truth here. Amazon, absolutely. All right. Give folks another like few seconds, see if anybody else wants to add. Wonderful. Training my dog new tricks. Awesome. Good. My partner follows, I think the dog is named Bunny on Instagram. and it pushes buttons that say words, and Bunny seems to know the words. And so I'm kept very up to date with Bunny's travels and what Bunny is doing. Great. Another laundry. I think, Bethany, I think you're playing with me at this point. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all. Thank folks, if you haven't had a chance to put it in, please still do. Make sure you put your name and organization as well. It's a good way for folks to kind of know who's who, and they can scroll through and say, oh, Amal Marks, she's at DPH. That's right. And she's a program coordinator. Wonderful. Good, good. Thank you. All right, we're going to move forward. I want to start us off with just a small group conversation about, okay, we'll go in the other direction. There we go. What did your upbringing tell you about home ownership? What did your upbringing tell you about home ownership? What messages did your parents or your community tell you about owning a home? And if you're currently a homeowner, how did it feel when you first became a homeowner? So we're going to put you into some small groups. We'll give you about 8 minutes or so in your small group. Make sure everyone gets a chance to share. What did your upbringing tell you about home ownership, whether it was your parents or your community or the people who you socialized with as you were growing up? What were the messages that they gave you about home ownership? And Tanaya is going to do the magic and send you into groups. When it pops up, you should be able to click. Some of you will just be whisked away into your groups. Some of you may need to come back to the main window, and if you go on that bottom bar, there should be a little breakout rooms tab that you can click, and that will give you the pop-up to go into your room when it's up and running. Folks are coming back. We'll give folks a little bit longer to come back from their groups. There we go. There's a few more folks. All right. Maybe they got a little longer time in. Keith, how's your morning? Can't hear you, brother.
I'm breathing, I'm having a great time.
There
Yes,
it
some
is.
very nice people.
All right, wonderful. You know, above ground, you know, that's always good.
Best way to start the day is breathing.
Breathing, absolutely. All right, looks like we've got most of our folks back. I know some folks have had some Zoom issues like I demonstrated earlier on. So if you get kicked off, feel free to come back and we can rejoin you into the right rooms or breakouts if it happens during the breakout. I want to hear from a few folks about what did your upbringing tell you about home ownership, and you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and get rolling. We are all friends here, but I will give you a chance to volunteer before I pick on Keith. So if there's a brave and lovely soul that would like to relieve Keith of the anxiety of having to, you know, go first today.
I'll share.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bethany. I think Jess was going to go after you too.
Oh, okay. I hope I didn't. I have my view on small.
You're good. She's fine.
Okay. Okay. I was sharing with my group that I actually read an article yesterday that was saying it wasn't until 1989 that credit score was a factor in buying a home. And that blew me away, right? And so for me, my upbringing taught a lot about how getting a home wasn't so difficult as it is now. and there weren't so many barriers placed on you. But at the same time, I don't know the exact year, and if anybody does, please correct me. It was like the late 60s or the 70s where women couldn't even get a mortgage unless they had their husband's signature on it. So but my growing up, like even folks that were working class or lower class were still able to afford a home because it was much easier to do than it is now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Jess.
Hi, excuse me. In our group, we talked about the differences that we had from where we grew up. So some people had seen everyone had owned a home and was really surprised to see that not everyone did when they got to college and moved. And one thing I shared was that my grandparents' generation owned homes, but my parents could not own homes. And just learning about that credit score factor, I wonder how much that became a factor for that generation and is still a factor in my generation. And for my partner and I, we still rent, happy to rent. And this was also shared in our group. We were all happy to, the burdens of having a house as well. So the pros and the cons, not having to do your own shoveling and things like that. And then also the burden of having to keep your house. And one person shared that it was really a struggle when things changed in their life and they had this house and all the emotional attachments and trying to keep it. And so that sums up what we talked about.
Okay, all right. We'll take one or two more. Anybody else want to share?
I grew up in the projects in Roxbury, and I was saying that, there was a stigma attached to it that it was bad, but we actually had fun growing up. Growing up in the projects, even if it's a snowstorm, you could go out and play, but you just played in the hall. Your mother said, go out and play. And you go out in the hallway and play and with your buddies, and you had all kinds of unique games. There's all kinds of adventures. When I bought my home, my grandmother owned a home, my aunt owned a home, and it was like when you bought a home, you arrived, you made it. And when I bought my home, my house, when I was raising my children before I bought the home, my house was the focal point of the neighborhood. A lot of kids come over there and hung out because I was a youth worker. Then when I bought my home, it still had that feeling, but it wasn't the same because it wasn't as connected as the neighborhood, because I grew up in a neighborhood where I was living and everyone knew me. But I did that. I made my house now I told my son, before you buy a house, make your home for us. In other words, you could lose your house, but wherever you lay your head is home. Where your home is, what's it?
Home is where the heart is, absolutely.
Yeah, so I tell families, make sure you understand what you're buying, because you don't want to leave it behind during the divorce, So, I mean, I work with a lot of men and I tell them this.
Thank you, Keith. We'll have to catch up on what part of Reedville you were in growing up.
No, I grew up in Roxbury.
Yeah, I know. I'm playing with you, brother. I'm playing with you. There's quite a distance between Reedville and Roxbury in Boston. Anybody else who would like to share? Anybody who's who is a homeowner and what it felt like when you first got your home?
I got my home just before the pandemic, and I'm the first one to have a home, buy a home, and I'm a grandmother. I bought it because of my grandchildren, because if I leave, I want to leave something to my grandchildren, because we were so poor. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, but we never had a home. We never had our own. My mother never really, my mother was so poor, she signed with an ex. So my mom didn't really have anything for us. So it was something that I brought in, and my kids are learning and my grandkids are learning. It's a rehab home. We're fixing it from ground up. We living in it, me and my husband, and we started to fix it. And I tell him it's a very nice house. It's 108 years old. And we have made it a home, and we're fixing it up little by little, and our grandkids just don't want to leave it. Because they're finding all these it's an old house, so they're finding all kind of crevices to go through. through the house. So I'm learning to be a homeowner, and it's a big change, but it's something that I feel good. At first, I didn't really feel it because it was new to me, but now, after with this pandemic and being home all the time, it's just became a home. In home ownership, it's hard, it's not easy, but it's better. It's better than renting, and it's hard renting, and it's better just having your own that you're paying for than paying so much rent and dying and not owning anything, not leaving anything to leave behind for your others. And for me, I see it as leaving it for my grandkids.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Part of the reason I want to start with this question is that it gets at how our values and the ways in which we've been raised and our experiences dictate how we feel about something as, material as a house. I mean, it really isn't the building, it's what your attachments are, where your heart is. Thank you, Keith, for that. But also it's about opportunity, and it's about who has been able to purchase a home and who has not been able to purchase a home, and what did that mean if you were able to. Someone mentioned the difference between their grandparents' generation and their parents' generation. The cost of a house in the United States between those two generations skyrocketed. So there's, depending on how old you are in this space, I'm going to say there are plenty of folks who are slightly younger than I am. I'm approaching 50. And so the folks who were, my parents' generation, or really maybe even their parents' generation, they were able to purchase a home because a home was, your average home in the, early 50s or so was maybe double what your yearly income was. So you could save, your parents might give you a little bit, you put it together and you purchase the house. That generation didn't really do mortgages that much. Mortgages were kind of a new instrument to them. An important one, because for a lot of folks that became how they became homeowners, but for a lot of folks, they, especially, you go back a few generations, a lot of folks bought their homes kind of cash, sometimes even literally cash. But the distance between that generation and now is that, your average, I think the average income in Massachusetts is somewhere in like around 60 or so, and the average home is like 450. You're never going to save 9 times what you make to be able to buy it cash. Like, that's not a possibility. So that's a huge difference in what kind of possibility most folks are afforded. Yet the benefits of it and what you're able to do because you own a home in terms of building wealth, that has not changed. And it is that gap between opportunity and people's experience that we want to interrogate a little bit here today to help us really look at racial equity in this space around housing, because that didn't happen by accident and it didn't happen by itself. So we're going to spend some time going there. And this journey in talking about housing and the built environment and equity will allow us to kind of touch a few different topics. And so throughout this, we will do a little bit of history. We'll look at some definitions, do some level setting, and also kind of build out the context. So as we're having the conversations, we can bring in some of the spaces that are also important to interrogate. So I'm going to move us forward. Thank you for having those conversations. We'll be having different small group conversations, so you'll be able to talk with a few different folks and get to know some of the people who are on the session with you. So I'm going to show you this graph. Some of you have seen this with me before. This is the racial ethnic composition of Massachusetts between 1980 to the projected composition in 2050. In 1980, Massachusetts was 92.3% white. Just show of hands, how many folks were here in 1980? On the planet, 1980. On the planet, okay, a couple folks on the planet. All right, few, okay, good. That's okay for those who weren't, that's all right. Edward Jacobs, you wanna go ahead?
Sure. What would you like me to say, Mo? Nice to see you again, by the way.
Good to see you too.
I
just
remember
saw
you
that
when you were starting out. You were 20 years old
Uh-oh.
back in the day.
You raised your hand, so I'm asking you.
Oh, do I remember 1980?
Mm-hmm. Were you around in 1980?
I remember. I was so I grew up in Brockton, and Brockton was a town that made a big shift.
Mm-hmm.
So my graduating class, 74, there you go, had almost 1,450 people in it.
Yep.
Maybe if you counted some people of minorities, I would say less than 100.
Mm.
Now Brockton High School, my two boys have graduated from there, and it's probably 75%, 70% majority minority.
Mm-hmm.
So different, that flip, that change we saw pretty clearly.
Absolutely. So when you look at this chart, and this is for everybody, there is a significant change in the composition of the demographics of the state in the last 30 to 40 years. If you look to the bar for 2020, we're about 74% white still, and that's actually whiter than the national average, which is this kind of grayish line down here. The fastest growing demographic is the Latinx population, followed by both the Asian and African American populations. I'm sorry, the Asian and the mixed or other populations. And the Black population's about the same percentage, a little bit over 6%, and it hasn't been growing as much. But for the experience of people on the ground is really different. So some communities have seen a large change in the demographics, and some communities have seen almost no change in the demographics. And housing has a huge, is a huge factor in that, that change making, whether or not housing was available to folks and whether or not they could have housing near employment. And so we're gonna kind of use it as a launch pad to help us to interrogate some of this stuff. I like to start conversations with this slide because it also makes people ask themselves a little bit about their own community. So if you're thinking about the community that you grew up in and the space that maybe you still live in, if you grew up and live in Massachusetts, does it look like this percentage mix, or does it not? Is it more diverse or less diverse? And then why is that? Someone mentioned that they, I think they were born in Springfield. I think that was you, Elizabeth. And Springfield also has had some demographic shifts over the years, and they've had lots of shifts. If you go back 120 years ago, they had different minority population groups, quote unquote, who have been there at different points. And the same thing with Keith's neighborhood in Roxbury. Roxbury was at one time a kind of like the Jewish enclave of Boston, and then it became Mattapan was a Jewish enclave of Boston, and the African American community has kind of been in spaces there and not in spaces before. If you can believe it, there's a part of the North End that's the original African American community in Boston. They actually called it New Guinea in the time. We'll talk a little bit about that when we look at the history. But we should be asking ourselves, why is it that our communities either look or don't look like these demographics, if this is what the state is starting to look like? All right, so I'm gonna move us forward, and we want to do a little bit of level setting. We're gonna be talking about equity and racism and racial equity. We just wanna make sure that we are having some shared definitions. I'm going to ask a brave and lovely soul to read that definition for us. Let's go with, how about Sarah? Would you read that definition for us?
Not on mute, I can't. Racism, the belief in the inferiority of a racialized group by the dominant group.
All right, thank you. This is kind of a classic definition around racism. That belief in the inferiority of a racialized group has to come from the dominant group. So it isn't just the inferiority belief by a group. It really is that the dominant group believes this other group is less than they are. So that's kind of the central part of racism, and that belief is across race. All right, it's not like some other difference. Important for us that we understand the history within the United States is that this racism has a historic root in slavery and in the development of the economics of the country. And so it shows up a lot because of that relationship to commerce. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Wanted to just expand on that a little bit. Racism is a system of oppression based on race. So always as we're thinking about anything that having to do with racism, we want to be thinking about who is being oppressed and how does that translate? What are the dynamics across race? It's a system of advantage also. Sometimes when we talk about racism, we're only talking about the people who are being victimized by it, and we think about those folks as the folks who are being oppressed, but it is also conveying advantages to the dominant group. The dominant group receives rewards by fomenting racism in the systems that they are in charge of. And so there's benefit there, whether it's conscious or subconscious. It's also this mix of individual prejudice and social and institutional power. All right. It's a way of thinking about this that's a classic definition for any oppression, but with racism, it really is about the prejudgment that an individual has about another person and the social and institutional power that backs that prejudice, backs the actions and decisions of that individual. Without that social institutional power, racism is just prejudice. It wouldn't rise to that level. But if you have a system behind it that reinforces this, that puts one group on top and another on the bottom, then you really get to the space where we're talking about oppression. Structural racism is where these different systems are all interacting with one another. So I'm going to ask another lovely soul to read this one. How about Vanessa?
Structural racism refers to the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. These patterns and practices in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and distribution of resources.
All right. So one of the reasons why some folks are told that they should, when they grow up, that they should have their own home is that it provides a source of wealth, and that source of wealth then allows them to make purchases, send their kids to college, some of those other things that being able to refinance and take equity out of your home allows you to do. Those things are supported by those other systems. Likewise, on the other end of that, if you run afoul of one of these systems, often it triggers the reaction from the other parts of the system. So if you run afoul of the criminal justice system, there are policies that preclude you from being able to attend, certain educational institutions, kick you out of public housing, for example. You've got a criminal record, you might not be able to get a loan, or you can't do some fiscal instruments. There are jobs that won't hire you. There are lots of ways in which these systems then play off each other and reinforce the group that has the power. And importantly, that as we're thinking about combating racism, that we have to think about it at that structural level. Just working on change making in one won't dissolve the power that we're up against. So one more, and just because we're in that health space, we always want to make sure that we're holding up health equity. Health equity is achieving the highest level of health for all people. I like this definition because it helps us to not just compare groups in terms of their health, but really be thinking about what's the highest level of health for everyone. You know, when you look at the health of the country in general, we as a nation aren't the healthiest people. And so we really should be reaching for something that's higher than the average or even who leads in health in this space. So making sure that we're reaching high. Our friends at the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, have released what is called Healthy People 2030. If you're not familiar, every decade, at the beginning of the decade, there's a kind of like a forecast for where we want to take public health, what we should be working on and what those goals are. And that's called Healthy People, and then whatever the next decade ends in. So Healthy People 2030 has been released, and they also update language and so forth. So one of the wonderful things that they've done here is updated the definition around health equity. Here it means that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be healthier, that this requires removing obstacles to health, such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences, including powerlessness and lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education and housing, safe environments, and quality medical care. Those of you who are familiar with the social determinants of health, it dovetails really well with those definitions. All right, so one more here. Racial equity is defined as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all people can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. We'll be talking about racial equity, especially the second definition is when race is no longer a predictor of negative outcome. Sometimes folks have trouble with that idea that we see race as a predictor of negative outcome. But when we actually examine the experience of different racial groups in the United States, we see some patterns that are impossible to ignore. So I'm going to share a graph from our friends at the Racial Equity Institute. And they looked at all these different factors in terms of child welfare, health, education, criminal justice, child welfare, and economic well-being in Massachusetts. And they compared the likelihood of having a bad outcome between African Americans and white Americans. And as you can see, that line across the bottom is what it is for white Americans, and for Black Americans, it's something like 2, 3, or 4, or 5, or 6 times higher likely that they will have a negative outcome. That high point is incarceration rate, is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated for an African American in Massachusetts than a white person. Some of the others are, around health and schooling. Child poverty is very high as well. The interesting thing about this graph is that when they do it for other states and for the United States as a whole, that blue line on top never crosses the red line on the bottom, meaning that at no point are you less likely to have a bad outcome as a Black individual in the United States than white people in the United States. And that's an important indicator for what we're seeing in terms of inequities, that it's not just in one place, it's across all these different systems. There are a persistence of inequities. Our friends at Racial Equity Institute also posit that that's how you know it's a racial inequity, that it is repeated in all these different spaces. We will share slides. We'll do a PDF of the slides that we can share. I want to, start to kind of think through where this all comes from. One of the things that any conversation about equity brings up is that we should be asking the question, why? Why is it that the disparity that we see or the inequity that we see is present? And when we ask ourselves that question, we have to both interrogate the current conditions, but also the historic conditions. How did we get here? And so that's the first space that we're going to start with. I'm going to do a quick history of racism and structural racism in Boston/Massachusetts to give us a sense of where this comes from. And then we'll take a little bit of a break. And then after that, we'll do a little activity. So Samuel Maverick brings 2 slaves to the Bass Bay Colony. This is 1634. Maverick Square in East Boston, that's the Maverick people. Governor John Winthrop in 1641 is a slave owner himself, and he helps write the first law legalizing slavery in North America. That's Winthrop, the town, that's the same Winthrop. And so Massachusetts, while it ends up having this wonderful history of fighting against racism, is also at the forefront of slavery and structural racism in the United States. In 1644, merchants began importing slaves. At that point, they were just sending them to Barbados and exchanging them for sugar to make rum so that they could then send that to England for basically for money. And it begins what's called this triangle trade, or the triangle trade that you see on the right-hand side there. Excuse me. African slaves come to what's called the New World. The colonies in the New World ship their goods up to New England. New England takes those things off the ship, makes goods, sends them all over the world, and sends the empty ship back to Africa to pick up more slaves. This triangular trade made the British colonies very, very rich, and England very rich in the early parts of our time as a country. So if you think about this as the from the mid 1600s into the 1700s, before the US Revolution, you had a lot of wealth building that was happening here. And it's one of the keys for why anti-Black racism and slavery at the time has been such a part of American society, is that unlike other experiences, or the experiences of others, this is a commercialization of that racist dynamic in a way that was building the country, and thus was really hard to pull out of the country. And we see our country struggle with that several times over in the course of the last 300 years. So Faneuil Hall, some of you have been to Faneuil Hall. Peter Faneuil was a very wealthy slave trader, and he and his family built Faneuil Hall. The so-called Cradle of Liberty is what they call the building, but this is also this tribute to a slave owner. Harvard Law School was built with land donated by a really rich plantation owner who sold some land to build the building. Merchants Row, which is no longer there, but is along that same kind of corridor in Boston, and that was where they actually did the slave auction. The North End, some of you may have visited the North End, which is now, and for probably the last 70, 80 years, has been a very kind of the enclave of the Italian community. But in the North End, you can still go and visit the old cemetery there. You can go to Copp's Hill. That was the original African-American community where free Blacks and some slave Blacks also lived there. And it was called New Guinea, which Guinea is a country in West Africa where people were from and where many of the slaves are being taken from. And so that was what they call that neighborhood. I'm bringing these up to show you that part of how Boston became this metropolitan area and became kind of a jewel in the so-called colonies is due to the wealth that was being built off of slavery. I'm going to show you a few slides that just illustrate kind of the history there, and I just want to say up front that it is an ugly history, and there are things that we, to honor that history, we have to make sure that we say out loud and that we don't sugarcoat. Mark Codman was a slave who was accused of killing his master, but the bigger crime there was that he was accused of reading the Bible as a way to figure out to kill his master. And folks are really against people of color, and especially Black folks, doing any kind of reading and writing. John Codman is related to the family that Codman Square in Dorchester is from, so there's some relationship there. I think it's one of his uncles is actually, or one of his, he's the uncle of the person who Codman Square is named after. Mark Codman gets accused of burning down the building, of doing all kinds of things. It's, you know, they were like throwing everything they could at him. And then he is hung, tarred, and encased in iron, which is the kind of drawing you see there on the right-hand side. And his body in the irons is put on display and hung on display in this corner for years. It's there for so long that it becomes a landmark. And so in Longfellow's poem about Paul Revere, he mentions that Paul Revere takes a turn where Mark hung, because that was the way that folks knew that corner. And that corner happens to be kind of, it's on the border between Charlestown and Somerville. It's still a reference for how folks understood that space. I use this to show you that this is highly integrated into American society as early as 1755. If you're a Massachusetts person, hopefully you've had a chance to take a trip on that red line that's painted on the ground and moves you around downtown Boston. Somebody knows what the name of that is, the Liberty Trail or something? Does that sound familiar?
The Freedom Trail.
Freedom Trail, there you go. I knew somebody would know it. It takes you by the space where Crispus Attucks, this mixed race, but always identified as Black person who died in the Boston Massacre, you know, likely the first person to die for the American Revolution. He was born in Framingham and he worked on the waterfront. And this happens to be a painting of him from that era. He's, you know, kind of credited as the kind of martyr for our revolution, or the beginnings of that revolution. And so America's always telling this really confusing tale about who matters and doesn't matter. And yet in those very moments, there are these people who spark up and are part of the history. So it's like you can't deny that these folks are there, even though there's a lot of hiding. Anthony Burns is a slave who escapes to Massachusetts and then is captured and sent back to Virginia, where he had been enslaved. This is during the time of the Fugitive Slave Act, so this is around 1853, and this sets the course for lots of the ways in which we kind of orient the world right now. So the Democratic Party at the time has a fissure, and Abe Lincoln leaves the Democrats and forms the Republican Party. And so that's where you get the two parties that we're familiar with now. This is also leading up to the big war and the Civil War around slavery. And so part of the effects of the Fugitive Slave Act is that we have a lot of abolitionists who step forward and say we shouldn't have slavery. We have an entire system that's built an economy on slavery. And so there come, you know, these two opposing forces are going to come to a head, and that's what we see in the Civil War. I'm not going to go like deeply into like the rest of the history there, but there's some really important pieces around racial violence and the kind of mass migration of African Americans Basically, after the Civil War, there is a backlash against the rising power of African Americans in the South. Post Civil War, African Americans were in Congress and looking to be in local government. And you see throughout the 1870s and 1880s or so, a mass removal of African Americans from those spaces, mostly by wanton violence. Like folks would go, and there's a few famous massacres where they kill 30 people, one where they kill 200 people. Most of what we hear about there as race related riots were mobs of white people going and killing and burning down the spaces that African Americans had been in. This starts off in the 1870s and through the 1890s, but it really picks up between 1890 and 1910 and 1930, where the Ku Klux Klan becomes really big, but also a lot of laws that try to recreate the power dynamic of slavery in the South, as well as other parts of the country. And some of those will come up when we talk a little bit more about housing. I'm going to stop us here and ask us to take a break. Welcome back all. I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen so we can get back rolling. Hopefully folks did something fun during break. Anybody do something interesting during break? Anybody do something interesting? Anybody take their dog out?
I emptied the dishwasher, Mo.
Empty the dishwasher. We'll take it. We'll take it. What did you do, Monica?
I took my little pup out to the backyard.
Took the pup out. Yeah.
Scratching at the door for a couple of minutes, so he had to go.
Okay. All right. All right. Good stuff. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming back and being ready to roll here. We're going to go ahead and get going. Before we went on break, I was just touching on a little bit of kind of the history of structural racism in the last century. We're going to watch a little video that'll help us kind of dig into some of that nuance. So I won't dig deep into it now, but lots of reasons why we see our communities shaped the way that they are now and as segregated as they are go back to the last century and some of the ways in which policy specifically separated people based on race and the eligibility for some programs that allowed some folks to experience a housing boom and other folks to not. And also a set of discriminatory practices that depressed the growth of specifically Black communities, in some places destroying them, and other places just really reducing the viability of those communities. So I want to use an example to help us kind of start to walk through some of the challenges that we're going to be looking at. And this next slide is a little provocative, so I just want to give folks a little bit of a trigger warning. This is a famous picture, but one that's challenging to look at. This gentleman's name is Ted Landsmark, and he happened to be coming out of, I think it was a government center, City Hall in Boston, and there were folks who were protesting, and he ends up getting attacked by this gentleman with the US flag. And this picture goes at what you could call viral back then, was on many newspapers across the country as a kind of a symbol of the racial strife that was happening at the time. This was part of, part of the challenge to the Racial Imbalance Act of 1965 that really said that in the Commonwealth, but specifically in Massachusetts, specifically in Boston, there was such an imbalance of how resources were being spent on children's education that something had to be done. And they spent the next like 7 years trying to figure out what that would be, and with lots of resistance to anything that moved resources away or took advantage away from white families and gave it to Black families. So they recognized that there was an imbalance, that there was a disadvantage that the Black students were having in terms of experience of education and resources and opportunities, but they couldn't find a way to remove the or rebalance the resources. The Boston School Committee resisted the act. Finally, in 1972, there was a desegregation order, and that began what was called racial integration busing. It has been called forced busing by its opponents. And so if you hear folks using the moniker forced busing, it really comes from folks who were working against it. At one point, because of that, the resistance was coming from the neighborhood, but it was also coming from the school system itself. South Boston High School is put into receivership and is run by the state. 500 police officers outside of the school to allow 400 students to go to school. And that was so that they could keep folks who were protesting against it from going into the school. At one point, the NAACP Boston headquarters is firebombed. This is a time where the kind of racial strife in the society shows up in one particular system, and it becomes kind of a burning point for the challenges of racial inequity in the space. And so we are still scarred by the history of racial integration busing and what it did in terms of rupturing some of the fabric of the city. And it doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but it's a big part of what people see. Some of the folks who were the proponents of not allowing busing to happen go on to become city councilors and take political power, and they extend some of the kind of racial segregation and separation further into Boston. And it's one of the reasons why Boston often is seen by people from other parts of the country as a really racist space, because it has this very visible history of this stripe over a long time, and other factors as well. I'm not going to say that it's not completely merited. Some of the other things that happened there is in 1982, part of in the Dorchester neighborhood, a part of the neighborhood is firebombed when a number of Black families move into it. This is an example of the kind of violence that was happening in other spaces as well, as neighborhoods were being integrated. Boston Housing Authority has been sued and is still actually being sued for some of the segregation practices that it did and how resources were spent on some areas and not others. Very famous incident with Charles Stewart, who shot his pregnant wife and shoots himself and implicates a Black man. So basically he says a Black guy did it, and the police force goes and harasses hundreds of men of color, and the police department kind of learns a lesson there, because he's found out later that he actually did it, and he ends up killing himself. His brother tells on him. It's also quite a bit of underinvestment in this time frame, pretty much from the 60s through the 90s and into the 2000s. There's an underinvestment in certain parts of the city as well. And the much promised rail line, they replaced the orange line and took it out of Roxbury. It was promised to be a train line, and it became the Silver Line, which is a bus. And that's where some of the ways in which how a city is even formed also follows some of the racist policies that are being applied, and where resources are being shared and not shared. And there's a really good example of how a community lost quite a bit, and what they got in replacement was a fraction of what they were promised. But I'm going to ask you to have another small group conversation. I'm going to tell you that for this conversation, I'm I want you to consider that for many people, where they live determines what their future is and also what their health is. And so in this scenario, you have a second grader in public school. She's scheduled to be bused across town to integrate a school in a neighborhood that you don't go to. So your choices are A, bus your second grader to that public school. B, move to be close to the school so your second grader can just walk there. C, leave town. Or D, send your second grader to a private school. We're going to give you 5 minutes in your small group. And when you come back, I want you to choose one of those and put in the chat what that choice is for your group. Choose one of those and put that choice is, or what that choice is in the chat. All right. You get about 5 minutes to talk with your group about what the choice should be. And this is difficult on purpose because this is part of what folks were being asked to do. All right. So Tanaya is going to do her magic and send you all off into small groups. We'll see you back in about 5 minutes and get a sense of where we are. All right. As folks are coming back, I'm going to ask you to have one person from your group give us in the chat A, B, C, or D. Which one did y'all resolve to? As folks are coming back, just ask you to put in the chat which one did you resolve to?
Can I say something real quick?
Please, Keith, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I took over our meetings. I was so, that brought back so much trauma. The gentleman being stabbed with the flag, the busing situation, the Charles Stewart, really, they ran buckshot through the neighborhood. So I'm sorry, I apologize to my group. I truly apologize. I didn't mean to do that, but it was just so, it traumatized me to see that picture again. It's not, and I don't want to sound over dramatic, but it was just like, you know, that was a time in my life that was mind-blowing and changed my view on life, and also made me dedicate myself to the work I do now. So please forgive me, my group.
It's all good, all good. Emily.
I don't know if you guys have the opportunity. I was wondering if we could see this everyone's answers in a poll instead of in the group chat, so we could visually see kind of where everyone was. I don't know if you guys have the option to do polling in your Zoom, but I know that I've used that in the past, and it's really helpful to kind of see the larger scale, what people are saying without having to scroll in chat.
I can tell you that it was almost all A's for all the groups. There was a couple folks that had like A or B, and a couple folks who couldn't pick. Not surprising, you know. We're 30 years ahead. You know, A sounds pretty good right now. It's a little bit easier to choose A right now, but for a lot of folks in the 70s and 80s, it was a really difficult decision to do this. I had a workshop I did with a church that had a lot of folks who were making that decision back in the 70s, and they struggled with what it meant to, you know, put their child on the bus, because it wasn't just that they were riding a bus, it was that bus was daily attacked by the people who were trying to stop it. They were throwing, you know, rocks and logs and stuff at it, and people genuinely feared for their children, as well as many folks in the Boston public schools chose C and D. There is this mass exodus of white families from the public school system in the 70s through the 80s, which really also pulled a lot of the resources in terms of people resources from those schools. And as folks know, your schools are based on how many students you have. So when you reduce the number of students, you also reduce the amount of resources and dollars that are available to it. This is a really good example of how the racial politics of the space affect some of the systems that touch the population, and really important to examine why that history did. It really was a revelation of the fracture of segregation that remained in a place where people thought that, you know, segregation wasn't as entrenched. So thank you all for doing that, for jumping in with that activity. Please go ahead, jump in. Go ahead.
I wanted to mention really quickly for anyone that's interested, Ruby Bridges is a movie that just came out on Disney recently. And this is exactly what it's about. It's Ruby Bridges is the first African-American child to disintegrate all-white school in Louisiana. And it was so powerful as a movie. I mean, just all of these conversations are very like activating for me, I would say. Just because this is a huge part of something that we talk about in our work and in our life. But yes, Ruby Bridges is a movie that's really powerful.
Good. We have a slide at the end of the presentation. I'll be right with you, Vanessa, where we're going to be adding any resources that people bring up. So please add them in the chat if you have ideas about things that will help people explore different issues. Please let us know. We really want to be able to capture that and share that with folks. I will probably do as I usually do, which is just put some books in front of the camera and show you some resources as well. Vanessa?
I was just going to say, you know, I think I'm also just curious as to the conversations that took place in the different breakout rooms around why people chose A, because I think that's another really interesting thing, because people chose A in our group, but for very different reasons, right? So like everything from, I think financially, that's where I would have to, you know, what I would have to choose, versus like, I have to live my politics. So I do this work. I can't, you know, I don't feel comfortable sort of opting into the best school, even if I could afford it, because my politics says like, I need to support public schools versus like, well, you know, some neighborhood schools are good. So maybe that's a better neighborhood school. So maybe that's the best option. So I think that, I think the example led to really great stuff, sort of looking at history versus now, but I think it also led to some really interesting reasons for choosing A contemporarily that may be a little bit different from the historical reasons for choosing.
And thank you for going there, Vanessa, because part of it is that it's a lot easier to choose A today. You know, you're not, you know, you're kind of like, okay, I can live this out. My child's going to be safe. They're probably going to get a good education. And those were not the beliefs of folks in the Black or white community at the time who were sending their kids across town into neighborhoods that they didn't go to. You know, if you know anything about Boston, it was really racially stratified and segregated. And so the folks who were sending their child to South Boston High, they had never been to South Boston because it wasn't a welcoming place for them. And the same direction with the kids who were being sent to a school in the quote unquote Black neighborhood. They had never been to that space, or they had only heard really bad things about it. So there's a lot of fear there. And this again makes us keep asking the how did we get here question. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about segregation because it's a big piece of what we end up seeing, and so much of what we see in the built environment is the segregation of resources that leads to inequities. So first, the segregation is not natural. We have this myth in America that people go and live with folks who are just like them. That actually only really happens when you are an immigrant and you come to live in a place where people that you know who can help you with acclimating and so forth. After that, folks really go to wherever they can go to. The problem was the segregation laws really made it hard for folks to go where they wanted to go, and most folks were choosing from options that they had. And I say that out loud because I also want to, you know, say that your parents or your grandparents, they may have wanted to live in a neighborhood that was diverse and had lots of folks, but they couldn't because those neighborhoods did not exist, or policies that were enforced didn't allow that to happen. So they were making choices from a limited set of opportunities, just as you know, people of color and white folks are making the same limited choices. Important for us to recognize that that's not, we shouldn't be blaming them for the lack of choices. Segregation is also ahistorical. We have in the past been less segregated than we are today. In many places, especially in our urban cities, we are more segregated today than we were in the past, but also in the rural spaces. One of the things that happened between 1890 and 1930 is that you had this mass migration of African Americans who left the South and came north, but you also had a migration from the rural areas, people who used to live out in the country, who, because of the fear of white mob violence, moved in closer to urban areas where they could be around more people of color and also around communities that didn't put them in danger. And so you have this doubling of the number of counties in America. Even though the population was expanding, you had a doubling of the number of counties in America that had no Black families at all, and also an expansion of the ones that had very few Black families. For example, in Maine, they went from having Black families in 18 counties to having Black families in 2 counties. So you have this migration of folks from the rural areas into more urban areas for safety, as well as people coming from the South up into urban areas. And that creates some of what we see today as segregation, but it really is ahistorical. You go back 200, 300 years ago, and there's African Americans living all across Massachusetts. Like, we don't think of, like, Great Barrington doesn't come up as the place where you would say, oh, there's a Black community there, but there's been Black folks living in Western Mass, in the Berkshires, for hundreds of years. That's not part of how we understand the spread of population in the state, because we've been fed this idea that folks have been segregated, been choosing to segregate, and this has always been there. Last but not least is that segregation is on purpose. This doesn't happen by accident. It's due to federal policy as well as local policy, social policy as well as government policy. And that's that mix that we really want to interrogate, is that this happens because there are specific laws that are in place that are creating the segregation that we see. So, you know, later on this weekend, when you're taking a look at the neighborhood that you live in, or thinking about the neighborhood you grew up in, it's important to kind of imagine what are the choices that were made that created the mix or lack of mix that you saw. Because that definition of who lived there also starts to define what the built environment looked like, what was in it, what was available, and what improvements were made and what improvements weren't made to it. 20 years ago, our offices in Boston, we expanded our office from the South End to Codman Square in Dorchester. And, you know, it's 6 miles or something, you know, in the city of Boston. The differences in what was available services-wise in the South End and what was available services-wise in that part of South Dorchester was really broad. And it's not something that we really understood until we got there.
Excuse me, Mom.
Yes, go ahead, Sharon.
I just, if you're open to getting, you know, commentary, I had a situation over just the last couple of months, and was required in social work class to consider more or less upbringing. Specifically, it's a diversity class, so related to privilege. And the thing I remembered about my high school is that I lived in a more suburban part of the same town called Poughkeepsie. But we lived in a little enclave or hamlet they called Spackenkill, also very Native American. But initially, there was no high school in the hamlet. We all went to the city high school, which was in the predominantly, or more predominantly, Black area. And they built a new high school. And they did so because they did not want the kids in the Poughkeepsie school. So it was like that kind of, it was like the other alternative. Anyway, I mention it because when I happened to look up some details about my high school, somebody in one of the state colleges in New York, a professor there, doctor of some social work, I presume, but anyway, or education, she had done a complete case study and there was a journal piece on the entire thing, you know, of
wonderful.
Yeah, so it you know, if not today or something, I'll maybe refer it. But anyhow, I while you were speaking, it just kept ringing in my head, so I just wanted to share. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of what I'm asking you to do is to really think about like the spaces that you're in. How were they created? Why are they the way that they are today? And not take for granted that they were made by the choices of the people who live there, but what were the forces acting on those choices that created the segregation that we see. We're gonna watch a video. I've listed two here. We're just gonna watch the second one, this disturbing history of the suburbs. It's a little lighthearted. They make some jokes. Some of them are perhaps challenging, but I'm going to ask us to walk into it with that same brave space that we walked into the training with. But putting the links here, and we'll put them in the chat so that folks can look at them on their own, and also some suggestions for a couple books that help kind of tell this story. So I'm going to try to share my screen and do this well so that we can watch this YouTube called The Disturbing History of the Suburbs. So I'm going to stop sharing this one. All right, and again, the most dangerous thing I do all day, sharing my screen. There's a good chance you'll get like, you know, some recipe for something. All right, you should see a YouTube page. Yes, you're with me. Awesome. Good to know, good to know. And Tanaya, you're going to tell me how to ensure that I'm playing the sound from the YouTube page?
Did you click share computer sound before you hit share? It's okay if you didn't, but did you?
I have not. Do I need to go back and do it?
Yeah, that works. That's easy. Just reshare with sound.
Okay. So stop sharing, yeah. And then hit share and share sound, right? Awesome. Yep. So I'm cooking with gas here, y'all. All right, I'm going to open this up so you can see the whole screen, I hope. Am I hitting the wrong button to do full screen? Okay, let's try that.
Hey, Adam here. If you like that, be sure to watch all new episodes.
Okay, that's enough of that. All right. Great. Any reactions to what you saw? Any thoughts about the video that we just watched?
I enjoyed it, Sharon. I enjoyed it, and honestly felt like it was a good way to do a quick course in redlining. Not meaning that I didn't know anything about it or its influences, but I think it touches on a lot of key points in a kind of light way. I mean, it's a heavy subject, if you will, altogether. So I thought, you know, if you took it, the parody of it with it, it was good.
Thank you. Other folks, thoughts about what you saw?
From helping and working in the school and doing a lot of work in the schools, when I lived in Springfield to Chicopee, it's a big difference. Springfield, we had to do a lot of fundraising for books, for papers, for equipment for the kids. Chicopee, you don't have to do so much fundraising. They have the books, they have the papers, they have the copy machines. So it is a big difference. It's a big difference when in schools in cities, and where one school has more privileges than the other school. And that's my opinion from working in the schools on their policies, their PTOs and all that. I've been in all of that. I've been president of PTOs and everything with my children and with my grandchildren. My children went to school in Springfield. I was involved. My grandchildren are in school here in Chicopee. I'm involved. It's a big difference. So yes, this did open my eyes and my head to yes, it is a difference.
Anybody else? Any other reactions to what you saw in the video? Keith?
If you look at Medco programs, they bring kids from the inner city out to the suburbs. They have to get up extra early in the morning, get on a bus that's sucking fumes left and right. While other kids who are living in the suburbs are resting and don't have to get up, and they get enough time to have breakfast, while kids have to leave their homes early, so they don't have a good breakfast. If you look at, I'm not going to mention the president's name, but if you look at his family's history, they were known for redlining, and they were sued and lost the cases for redlining. Look at that picture of the gentleman being stabbed with the flag, and look at what happened at the White House recently. It's on a larger scale. So this is still going on today, if not more magnified. I just think that I'm against Medco because all schools should receive the same funding and same care. But like you said, the property values, the taxes come into play. So kids are going to be at disadvantage. And then you look at when they have to take that MCAS test, they're not going to do as well because they don't have the resources. So you're falling behind further and further and further.
Thank you, Keith.
I'd actually like to just kind of bounce off that, just talking about the systematic advantages. And honestly, the way the suburbs especially act to invent this class of white. You know, it's interesting. You know, I was talking with my parents about this idea of public schools and which schools you go to, how you choose a neighborhood. And my parents talking, my mother especially, about the fact that she grew up, and you know, you can see me. I've turned on the video for that person. I'm white now. My mother talking about when she was growing up, she was Italian, and Italian wasn't white.
Wasn't white enough.
But you create this class of white. And you integrate first the Germans, then the Irish, then the Italian, to create this class of white, so you can literally use it to divide society. And the way that you lock into this set of advantages, whether or not you want them, but that creates this power dynamic that you then try to preserve for your children and your grandchildren, because you have it and you don't want to lose what they have. But you don't want to sit there and say, I'm taking it away from someone else. You know, we're all that guy saying, but I worked hard to get what I have. But it was that really wonderful speech by President Obama. What I have, I didn't build them. I was given advantages by my family and by society that gave me a leg up that I in no way personally earned. And it's hard to sit there and see it and know that what I have is partly, frankly, stolen from others by the way they've been disadvantaged.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate that. Fernando and then Abigail.
Yeah, hi. I just, one of the things that I think about often, especially watching this video, is, we seem to often get stuck in this place of acknowledgement, which is really important. It's important to acknowledge our history. It's important to acknowledge, how the basis for a lot of these disparities and inequities that we're seeing. Where I feel like stuck is that often we hyper focused on solutions to prevent it from happening, which is also important, but we don't turn back to look at, well, okay, great, but all this stuff happened. How do we repair that, right?
How do we repair it?
This is where I think when we start talking about reparations, people lose appetite. Well, wait a minute, well, that's going too far. But if you look at the imbalance that you see in graphs and data and research, you have to go back to figure out a way to repair all this if we really want to truly see equity. And I think we say a lot of, not when I say we, I mean globally, we say a lot of this stuff, but I think we need to focus more on how do we repair a lot of this damage that so much of this stuff is built and predicated on.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Fernando. Abigail?
Hi, Fernando. Fernando's my boss. One kind of building off of that, one thing I think we always get into with these kinds of discussions is just the vicious cycle of it all, right? The cycle of poverty, the cycle of redlining, and housing and stuff like that. And I think we need to get into a cycle of repair, where it's like, we do talk a lot. We talk a lot and we're like, okay, we're recognizing stuff. Great. And I think there's a lack of action sometimes. Like I was just having this discussion with a friend who works at one of the Boston high schools. And she said, did you know that they won't offer any AP classes here? And I said, well, why? She goes, because the governing board or whatever thinks that the students won't do well. So why offer it? And I was like, well, then how are they, but by the converse there, how are they giving the students the opportunity to succeed? And it's like, you can't just say, like, assume like, oh, nobody's going to do well. There has to be some investment in possibility in order to see what can and will change people's lives.
Absolutely. It is one of the big challenges for, for many programs and many school systems is that idea of what is the expectation of these different bodies, and those expectations, conscious or subconscious, create what's possible for young people. If you don't take, algebra in the 8th grade, you can't take calculus in high school. If you don't take calculus in high school, you can't be a software engineer at MIT. So a lot of people are cut out of the system before they even get a chance. Emily. We can't hear you, Emily.
Oh, I was just going to say, to kind of jump off that, in Worcester, almost the entire school committee is white. Older white, not a single one of them has a student or a grandchild in the public school systems. And because it's not by district, all the people voted into school system is from the more affluent areas of the city who have no youth or students or kids who go to the public schools, all go to private schools. Yeah. So it's like institutionalized down to every level. When you fight for inequality, it's like you have to then fight for voting rights. And it just is kind of like, it's not just one thing, it's a lot of things that have to move forward together at the same time to even chip away at this decades and decades long problem that we face. And right now, luckily, there are people moving forward trying to sue Worcester school systems for forcing it to be this way and creating this forced segregation because of how the voting system works.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. All right, we want to take our second break. Let's do 5 minutes for this one. Folks did really well with that last break, so I'll trust you to do it again well. and let's be back in 5 minutes, and we will dive a little bit deeper into one of our case studies. So I'll share my screen again if I'm smart and able to. Yeah, I think I did it right. Somewhat, sort of, kind of. Okay, we'll take it. Those again were some of the kind of resources there. Folks to take a look at. We will paste in the chat those links so that you can take them with you. And we're going to go ahead and move forward here. So some of what came up in that video were the interweaving of social and government policies that affect housing. There were laws that forced segregation that basically said you could not live in a town if you were of a certain background or if you weren't white. When those were done away with, there was several legal challenges to it that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Pretty much unwritten laws that did the same thing and pushed folks out. We talked about some of that, the white kind of race riots that threatened and moved people out of rural areas, destroyed complete Black communities. There's a really famous one that folks are more familiar with now because it was included in a television program around Tulsa and what used to be called Black Wall Street. But there are stories like that all over the South, many in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, etc. The other practices that are really of import are racial covenants and redlining. I'm going to show a couple examples in a moment. But also in this era, the New Deal, which brought the country out of the Big Depression, left most African Americans out in terms of being able to participate in any of the wealth building and jobs programs. The U.S. Housing Authority set federal housing policy that didn't allow most African Americans to participate. The GI Bill was not available to African Americans, so a lot of the folks in that generation who went to college and bought their homes based on the GI Bill, African Americans didn't have that as an opportunity. Part of what they mentioned in the video of the urban renewal and kind of the highways that were being built, displacing Black communities, the Mass Pike, which runs through the center of our state in Massachusetts, went right through the 150-year-old African-American community in Newton and displaced about 3/4 of it, destroying it basically. And so, you don't think Newton Black community, but there's been a Black community there for 150 years. It just got pretty much dislocated by the highway. As was mentioned, between 1934 and 1968, 98% of home loans went to white people. Thus, you have this huge wealth gap between whites and Blacks in America and other groups as well. Public housing, public housing was originally for white people and only white people, very often restricted. They built some that were specifically for people of color, but separate. We talked about the highways and the wealth building gap, but also that all of this includes investments. So it's layers and layers of public policy that creates a segregation that we see and maintains the advantage. And school segregation and school funding, we've already talked about. But I want to spend a little bit of time giving you some examples of this and then do a little case study. We're going to look around climate change. So this is an example of a racial covenant. So this is what would have been written into the deed of the property that you purchase. No lot shall ever be sold, conveyed, leased, or rented to any person other than one for the white or Caucasian race, nor shall any lot ever be used or occupied by a person other than one of the white or Caucasian race, except such as may be serving as domestics for the owner or tenant of said lot while said owner or tenant is residing therein. All restrictions except those in paragraph 8, the racial exclusion, shall terminate January 1st, 1964. These racial covenants were outlawed in the 60s, but they had been in place for, you know, at least a generation, some places even more. Some were less official, but many were written into the deeds. And also, as people tried to challenge them, they were being sued, often even arrested. So if you bought a house and you weren't supposed to be able to buy that house, the government would come in and remove you. You wouldn't get your money back. You wouldn't get the house, and you'd have to serve time in jail and pay the $10,000 fine. And these were practices that were happening all over the country. We sometimes paint the South with this brush of overt racism that's enforced by the systems, but this was happening in Illinois. This happens to be in Minnesota, across kind of the northern states as well, including Connecticut, New York, to some extent, New England. This is one of the things that's really hard to find now, because after 1964, you couldn't have these racial covenants in the deed, so they were removed, but the effect was kind of stays there. If you can imagine, if your grandparents bought that house, they probably lived there or passed it on to someone in your family. And so the segregation that was started under this policy remains. And to Fernando's point, we haven't really interrogated that stuff and start to do any healing, and partly because we haven't done the truth and reconciliation that you would need to do for this work. I want to show you some examples of redlining. This is a redline map of the Boston area. And I'm going to show you a little close-up so you can get a better sense, because this is, unless you're like super familiar with a city, you may or may not see where things are. But this is South Boston over here, going into Roxbury in the South End in here. And if you just notice that little spike there, this area here is where we're going to concentrate. This is a kind of more recent history, African-American population. And we'll see that this is pretty much where also the Jewish population had been before. And one of the things about those redlining maps is the populations that were being excluded were Blacks definitely, and often Jews as well. And so those two groups were the ones that ended up where you see the redlining. If folks are familiar with other parts of the city, you can see where there may have been other people of color or Jewish populations by where the red was. Also immigrants, so the kind of highly, that's the North End over there. They also often were being, and the Old West End, before it was torn up, they also were being redlined. This is Cambridge over here, and where there had been African-American populations and people of color was redlined, and that dissipates later on. You'll see it in the next maps, but I want to show you a close-up so you can see it a little bit better. And so if you're familiar with the city, you can see some of the contours of neighborhoods in there. And this is in the, I think the map was like 1934 in the 30s or so. And so where you see green and blue, that's really good. Yellow's kind of on the border, and red is not good. And this is how they described it. And then also it wasn't that this was like nice or not, it was that then you weren't able to get a mortgage or get insurance on your mortgage in those areas. And so banks would just not loan to you. You couldn't get a loan to do something in those spaces, and thus the underdevelopment of those areas. Any questions about what redlining is? There are some redline maps for that Holyoke, Chicopee area as well. There aren't surviving maps for everywhere, but the metro areas tend to have those. So you can see how how these things persist, and what was redlined now almost 80 to 90 years ago remains underdeveloped. So this is a census map for the Boston area in 1980. If you, the darker colors, so like that dark blue and the dark green, are areas where the dark green is more than 40% Black, and the dark blue is up to 90 to 95% or more than 95% Black. And then the deep red and orange are low Black population spaces. So this is 1980. You see this concentration of very, very segregated neighborhoods in terms of the number of Black folks there. And then I'll show you the next one is 2013. And what strikes you about the difference between these two maps? 1980, 2013. What do you see there that's different about those two maps? What strikes you as different?
There are almost no dark blue spaces anymore.
Yeah, there's no dark blue spaces anymore. The very dark blue spaces are gone. Most of those neighborhoods that were over 95% to 100% Black no longer exist. You see a reduction also in the neighborhoods that were where there was no Black people at all, or under 1% Black folks. Yep. Anything else? Any other observations there? Jasper?
Yeah, it's somewhat indirect, but all the maps reminded me, I just wanted to say a land acknowledgement that for who, you know, if you're living in Middlesex or Suffolk County right now, that land is stolen land that belongs to the Massachusetts and Wampanoag peoples. And I'm over in New Jersey, and this land belongs to the Lenape. So just important, I think, while we're talking about land, to just talk about the original owners of the land and who it still belongs to. And I'm gonna go quiet my dog now.
It's all good. Thank you for that. And often the members of those nations will say this is unceded land. They did not give it up. Unceded land of these different peoples. Thank you for that. One of the things that we notice here is that there are spaces that continue to have high concentrations of people of color, and we're going to look and see how these are affected by some of the issues with climate change. So just, we talked a little bit about the stuff around housing. I do want to also mention that when you redline in certain areas, and those are the only places where people of color, especially African Americans, can live, then the price for rent also is artificially inflated in those places. And so you have smaller bits of land and housing for a growing population, so rent goes up, and people are not only not building wealth, but they're also paying more for less quality supply of housing. And then Black neighborhoods that were often destroyed. There are other practices like the height of bridges not being high enough so that city buses can't go out to the suburbs, the train lines that we are now building everywhere, like that, all that green line extension and the old red line extension, and even some of the other extensions on the purple line, the commuter rail, those were all fought against because they didn't want people from the city, quote unquote, going out into the suburbs. And now they do. Now they want to come in, but they didn't back then, and that's part of the dynamic that we see. All this creates a huge household wealth gap. Hopefully folks have seen this one before. This is household wealth in greater Boston area. For white families, $247,500. For Caribbean born or Caribbean ancestry Black families, $12,000. for Puerto Rican families, $3,000, and for US born Blacks, $8. And the huge difference here is home ownership. That is the way that wealth is transferred in most households, and the way that most households hold wealth is including the value of their home. And if you're looking at that $8, well, how can that be? Think about if you at any one moment took all of the money that you owe and all your assets. If you owe $15,000 on credit cards and only have $2,000 in the bank, you're in the negative. So even though you have some people who have wealth and have some assets, when you add up all the people that don't have the value of their home to be the valuable asset, all their other liabilities bring the dollar value down to something like $8. First time I saw this, I was like, this is impossible. And then when you look at home ownership rates differences in these communities, it's completely there. It's like absolutely viable. Any comments on that before we move forward? Cool. So we want to spend a little bit of time today thinking about environmental racism and climate change, and how some of what we see is disproportionately affecting communities of color, and what is it that we should or could be doing about it. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of what we're seeing in terms of disproportionately suffering, some neighborhoods who are disproportionately suffering from environmental racism and the effects of climate change. And all of these are from our friends at MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and it's all publicly available. We'll give you the link. You can find these. They have maps and wonderful data that they visualize and make really amazing graphs for. This is a fairly simple one, but a really important one. This is the pollution proximity index. So how close are you to pollution? And if you notice, it goes from 0 to 5. 0 is like almost none, and 5 is like the really high. And where there's high pollution, there are more people of color. And that's partly because where folks have been allowed to live, and what has been allowed to happen in the neighborhoods where those folks live. I don't know if Keith is still with us, but one of the practices that I remember in the 80s in Roxbury was that the garbage trucks would come and dump the garbage in the neighborhood instead of taking it to the dump. Because at the dump, they had to pay per ton or something. And if they just went and dumped it in an empty lot in the neighborhood, then they got paid for picking up the trash and didn't have to pay out, so they made more money. Also, trucks were routed through the neighborhood, through the Black neighborhood, and all of the chemicals and so forth and particulates that came through that traffic happened more in those spaces. And many of the white neighborhoods have the no truck signs, and more streets are created so it's hard to get quickly through it, so trucks would never go there. Another one for air quality, this is tree cover. If you notice, there's some obvious places where tree cover is going to be less than other places. So I'm a map person, so I like find the airport really easily. So not a whole lot of trees at the airport. They kind of get in the way, so I've been told. But we also see that in this area here, if you remember in the other maps, this is that Roxbury area stretching down. There's a lot less tree cover there than there are in other parts of Boston, and certainly other parts of other communities. It's a lot less dense there. And it has the effect of not removing pollution that trees are really good at, but also not providing shade, when we'll get into that in a moment. Any questions on this map?
It's not really a question, it's just a comment. It makes me think of what Keith was talking about when you're taking the kids out on the camping, for the good of the cause, go join the privileged kids that get it, you know, year round, so to speak. And you're going to find them right where all this green is, I bet.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where those schools are. You know, in New York, they're famous for the fresh air camps, which are basically just getting kids out of the city to go to places where there was fresh air. But it meant also getting them away from places where there wasn't much coverage. This is a flood map. So this is what it would look like, the chance of flooding with 3.4 feet of sea level rise by 2070. One of the things to notice is that there's coastal flooding and flooding that goes along rivers, but then there are areas that are low-lying, and those low-lying areas have lots of possible flooding. So if you look in here, there's a lot of possible flooding. And this again is that area and that neighborhood of Roxbury in the South End, starting to get down to Dorchester, part of South Boston there. That's the waterfront that's just been built up that could be underwater in the next 50 years or so, if we continue on the path that we're on and the sea level rise that we have. And again, these lower lying areas are the areas more susceptible to flooding. It's not like they're gonna, you know, magically happen in the year 2070. They're already experiencing the effects of this in these spaces. Any questions about this map?
Just actually a quick comment, thinking about out sort of western end of the state. When you look at flooding, you know, in this part of the neck of the woods, you know, in 19th century industrialization, you're also looking at the areas that were heavily industrialized because of the mills, and those are also often then low-income housing, which unfortunately income often does also correlate with race. So you're in a place that's more likely to flood, you're in like places that were more likely to have industrial pollution. That flooding then moves that pollution to places where persons who are less economically advantaged live. And it's still a huge issue in terms of talking about pollution cleanups and Superfund sites.
Yeah. Superfund sites, which, you know, are often called brownfields as well. Many of those are, you know, almost like an overlap of where it is that people of color live in those cities and communities, either right next to or actually in those same neighborhoods. Ashley, you look like you're looking at something specific there.
I'm just looking at the chat box. Thank you, though.
Okay. Awesome. I thought you were looking at the map. Last one, this is land surface temperature. Now, first time I saw this, I was like, that's incredible. That's impossible that it would feel that hot on the ground in these spaces. And again, what you see is a whole mess of red in the urban core in here. And again, certain neighborhoods who, the South End and Roxbury, who have more of that deeper red color, which is a higher temperature. Over here by the airport, it makes sense because they've got big, giant open field that's mostly tarred over, and so it just gets really hot and bakes there. But that same effect that you would see on the runway is happening in neighborhoods in North Dorchester, South Boston, the South End, and Roxbury. And many other communities. If you see some of these streaks like that, that's because that's a street. So if you see those lines like that, that's a long, I think that's Route 1 perhaps there, 93 goes in through here. So those long stretches of highway also attract and hold a lot of heat. Any questions or thoughts on this map? So I'm going to ask you to spend a little bit of time in some small groups. In your small group, I'm going to ask you to think about what are some ways to address these inequities. You can do one of the three areas. You can take on air quality, sea level rise, or heat islands, which is what that last map was. This map, anywhere where you see an area where there's high heat surrounded by an area where there is low heat, we call that area that is high heat a urban heat island. So these urban heat islands is what the topic of this one. So we're just going to ask you to, in looking at this, your small group, to choose one of these three areas. And what we'd like you to do is, like, what are two ways to address that inequity? And I'm going to push and say, what are two policy changes that would help change the impact of climate change on those neighborhoods where they're experiencing these climate change inequities? Any questions about what I'm asking you to do? So Tanaya is going to work her magic again, and we are also going to share in the chat a link to this this chart so that you all can write in the chart under whichever one you want to put your policy changes to impact climate change. So make sure at least one person in your small group has clicked on the chart. We're going to put that into the chat before Tanaya sends you off into your groups. We'll give you about, let's say 10 minutes in your small group, and then we'll come back and see what you've come up with. Please make sure you're putting your thoughts on that sheet, and spend some time right in the beginning choosing which of these three areas, air quality, sea level rise, or heat islands, you want to focus on. All right. And Tanaya is going to make her magic happen. And then some of you should be whisked away. Some of you might need to press a button. Maybe mouse over the bottom of your screen.
Emily, believe that it has to do also with living conditions we're in. We're piled on top of each other, even in projects or close quarters. We work many minorities work in that are not conducive to having a healthy body or healthy immune system to fight the virus. And that's one of the environments, is the environment we're living in, we're working in, is set for a virus to take place.
Well, that's definitely some of the factors that have caused some of the disproportionate impact on communities of color, both the working environment and the living environment, and also the exposures because of the work that they're doing, overrepresented in the, COVID facing populations. And, it's hard to social distance with 6 people and 800 square feet. It's different if you got a house in the suburbs and you can live on one half of it or something like that, that people do, but can't really get away when you're, sharing a bedroom or something. So lots of food for thought there. Want to hear back a little bit from what folks did in their small groups, and I know that we have a document where you put in some words there. So any highlights? Anybody have like a hot idea that came up in your conversation for one of those three climate change issues? Ashley, go ahead.
So one thing I recently learned about is called green walls. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with that, but I thought of that for air quality because I think that it tackles a lot of different issues in addition to air quality. So it's like, I think of a place like Boston where there's a lot of concrete buildings. And so instead of just concrete, you basically make a vertical garden on that wall. And depending on the size of the wall, that can be a lot of plants. And the more plants, the more oxygen to help air quality. But also some of the plants could be edible. So like different vegetables or spices to give healthy foods or even free foods. But I also think of like how it can improve mental health because it's a lot prettier to look at than a concrete wall. And we know that the color green helps boost mood. And also like for a lot of people, they need to have some sort of routine, something to take care of. So I know that there's research on like having plants or a routine can also help with your mental health as well. So that was one idea I thought of for air quality, but could also have these other trickle down positive effects.
Cool. Thank you so much. Jasper.
Yeah, so we actually didn't talk about this in our group, but what Ashley said reminded me. I want to bring up. There's this really interesting small movement of folks called guerrilla grafters, and what they do is they graft pieces like branches of fruit trees to pre-existing trees in public areas to basically help grow free fruit for folks. Since right, I think there's a lot of political reasons why there aren't free fruit trees just lying all around. So I wanted to uplift that. And then also in our group, we talked a little bit about looking at some root causes of air quality. And so thinking about things like universal basic income or direct cash reparations and things like that to basically lift up the incomes of folks who live there, and the domino effect that that'll have when thinking about the quality of where you're living, and if you have lead in your home, things like that, if you live near a highway, a lot of these things will sort of disappear over time if you increase the income of a neighborhood.
Thank you, Jasper. One of the challenges for a lot of spaces is who is going to live there if we make the changes, and how do we keep the people who are living there now once we've made those changes that are improvements. They are improvements to that stock and the possibilities for people who are there. So absolutely. And that balance is really important too. Anybody else on any hot ideas that came up in your small groups? Now, I saw somebody yawning, and that got me yawning. So I'm gonna try not to blame you. But anybody else, any hot ideas that happened in your small group? Anything that you talked about?
I think I see Emily's hand raised, Mo.
Oh, go ahead, Emily. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Well, we talked a little bit about, I think, a lot of different topics on transportation and how, increasing public transportation would in fact reduce pollution and improve air quality, and how there's such a lack of transportation. And even right now, we were talking about how it's almost like COVID giving the state an excuse to limit transportation because it has less ridership. So they're actually reducing public transportation, which is, if not more, needed now. It's going to make it easier for them to keep it cut instead of increasing it, which they should do. But just kind of quickly to address, I think, some of that, if you make a place better, and then it kind of becomes gentrified, right? If you make nice trees and stuff, it creates a gentrification situation. But I think that's why people should really reenact and use the land trust more. I know a lot of the CDCs use them, where if the land becomes under a trust, there's all sorts of requirements that go with that to continue it to keep in low income. And so I think there are systems that do exist to continue making sure that this places that won't get gentrified. It's just kind of using those and pushing the states and communities to enact those and beef those up more so that they can really keep spaces for all families.
All right, thank you. Good stuff. Anybody else? Other hot ideas that came out of that conversation?
I'll speak up, but we've already talked once, Mo, if you want to call somebody else.
Why don't you give me the 30-second version?
Well, Ashley mentioned in our group, bicycling and obesity as kind of a twofer, where if we can get people out of their cars and using active transportation, that we get both a reduction in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, which reduces air pollution, and also burn calories, which has mental health benefits. And through COVID now, we're seeing that people are stressed. It's like, this is like a trifecta. There's many points of like multiple benefits if we start redesigning our places of where we live. And you throw climate in there and it's like, we need to synergize on some of these benefits. I'll just shut up because there's so many ways this can work out to be actually to our benefit.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Any other comments? Abigail, you just put something in the chat. Do you want to mention what that is?
Yeah, I'm just gonna shamelessly self-promote myself.
What?
So I co-authored an article last year, the year before, about the intrinsic mental health benefits of community gardening based on research I did in Roxbury. So if anybody's interested in stuff like that, it talks about community health, both in the actual food, in the environmental health, and the mental health. So just figured I'd pop that in there.
Wow. Great. Absolutely. Citation. All right.
That's awesome. I want to just show you one last thing before we close out, because one of the things that was talked about, at least, and mentioned, I forget exactly who mentioned it, was that there are some impacts on health from the spaces that y'all are looking at right now. And a couple of them have some really direct impacts that are important to mention. So, for example, the air quality, there's been quite a bit of research to show that if the air quality is poor in a community, then the risk for COVID infection actually goes up. So that the air quality creates a susceptibility to being infected in the space. And so that's for me, that's a really easy and direct way to see how the decisions that we've made and some of the things that are in place are exacerbating the situation we find ourselves in right now vis-a-vis COVID. But I wanted to make sure that we don't walk away from this table without talking a little bit about how we amplify community voice, because for most of the folks on this call, we're the professionals in a way, and that comes with some baggage, and we need the voices and the choices of members of the community who are closest to the pain, to borrow a phrase. And there's just 3 ways to really amplify community voice I'd like you to walk away with. One is creating spaces for community leadership. So where is it that the people who live in the community who are disproportionately affected by these things, where is it that they can lead, whether that's a civic organization or a community-based organization or a for-profit corporation? Where in there do they have the ability to be in leadership? Secondly, community members define the problem and the solution. So how do we convene and provide space for community members to say what it is that they see as a problem and propose some of their solutions? We can, kind of work it from the academic sense to death, and then we come up with interventions that might work, as opposed to interventions that are crafted by the people who are deeply engaged with the issue already. And last but not least is this advocate by leveraging and relationships and membership. There's a space for working with organizations that are in this space and leveraging the kind of pressure to do some of the things that we want folks to do. But for community members, it's about creating places where what they bring, the relationships that they have, the memberships that they have are now valuable as well. So as you're thinking about engaging and involving community residents, think about creating space for their leadership, having them define the problem and the solution, and then finding ways to leverage the relationships that they already have, as well as the ones that you are creating with them. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for being deeply engaged with us. We have a feedback form. We're going to put in the chat the link. We'll also send it to you. So if you don't get it, get a chance to pull it off the window today, you can definitely get it online, and we will email it to you email the link as well, so you get a chance to give us some feedback. Kelly, anything that you want to add before we close out?
I just really want to encourage folks to take that feedback survey. While also giving a shout out to our project manager, Gina Rodriguez, who just joined. Usually she does this spiel, so I wanted to make sure that she was recognized in this training. So please make sure to fill out that survey. We'll send it out in a follow-up email along with the recording and with the slides. Also be on the lookout for more newsletters from us because we have an exciting panel coming up in March about COVID 1 year later. What's changed, what have we learned, and how can we apply these lessons learned to future public health crises or public health case studies. So hope to see you all there, and really thank you all for your presence and your engagement today.
Thank you all. It's great to